Whether we'd like to admit it or not, Western Europe is the birthplace of the modern world. It is currently one of the safest and most prosperous regions on the planet, with some of the highest standards of living and very few interstate military conflicts, with a notable exception. However, it always hasn't been this way. For much of Europe's history, the continent was engulfed in warring tribes, clans, kingdoms, empire states, and religions, all vying for control. So let's have a disgustingly oversimplified history of the continent and its geography. Speaking of geography, Europe really isn't a continent. As you can tell, there are no major bodies of water that are separating Europe from Asia. So technically, it's part of the Eurasian landmass. The two continents are separated by the Ural Mountains in Russia and the Caspian Sea. It's astonishing how much we learn in school is actually bullshit. Anyway, most of Europe has a temperate climate, with relatively warm temperatures given its latitude. This is due to the Gulf Stream, which pushes warm currents from the Gulf of Mexico to Europe. Hence why Rome and Istanbul have warm Mediterranean climates, while another city of roughly the same latitude like Toronto is a frozen hellscape. Europe also has numerous mountain chains, most notably the Alps, as well as smaller, countless other ranges of mountains and hills, along with waterways, which oftentimes act as barriers to movement and cultural exchange, which might explain why there are so many varying ethnic groups and identities on the European continent. Europe is also home to numerous navigable rivers. Some of the most notable are the Danube and the Rhine, both of which act as major transportation highways and support major population centers. Despite being very mountainous, Europe does have flat land, namely the unoriginally named European plain, stretching from the coast of France to the Low Countries to northern Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, and much of western Russia. Due to this lack of natural barriers, these portions of the continent are the most vulnerable to land invasions. However, they also have some of the best farmland. Europe not only benefits from a system of rivers, but also a system of lakes, temperate climate, and access to the Atlantic Ocean, along with various seas such as the Mediterranean, North Sea, and Black Sea. Europe does surprisingly have a few deserts as well, most notably in Spain, but by and large these are semi-arid and pretty pathetic. Anyway, Europe suffers from a relative lack of hydrocarbon resources. Sure, they have tons of fish, water, farmland, but they don't really have that much in terms of mineral wealth or oil and gas. The only parts of Europe that have a lot of oil are Norway and the UK, and that's usually offshore in the North Sea. This is part of the reason why Norway is not a member of the EU, as sharing your oil kinda sucks. Now let's move on to a disgustingly oversimplified overview of European history. Trying to condense all of Europe's history in order to better explain its future is bound to fail, but I'm going to try anyway. First, there were some pre-Indo-European peoples. They didn't write anything, so we really don't know that much about them other than they built these weird stone thingies. The Basques in Spain are arguably the last remnants of these people groups as far as their language is concerned. Later on, Indo-European peoples with horses and wheeled carts would bring themselves, their horses, and their language all over the European continent from the steppes of Ukraine or perhaps Turkey. Nearly all European languages, with a few exceptions, come from this Proto-Indo-European language, except for the Basques, which are pre-Indo-European, as well as later groups such as the Hungarians and Finns. The first complex civilization in Europe were the Minoans on Crete, in modern-day Greece. They exploded to death, probably due to this volcano. Then the Mycenaeans came along to dominate the mainland of Greece. Eventually, a number of city-states popped up, namely Athens and Sparta. The Persians, led by this drag queen-looking guy, tried to conquer them but failed, as the Greeks united. But after the Persians were defeated, the Greeks went back to fighting each other. The Greeks also set up colonies around the Mediterranean, most notably in what is now Italy, where they would influence another civilization that shared their love of homoerotic art, the Romans. After halting the Persian advance, Athens had a golden age, with advances in philosophy, science, medicine, literature, drama, religion, technology, democracy, and pederasty. This is really where Western civilization begins, sort of. Then we'll fast forward to Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who takes over most of Greece, conquers Persia, goes as far as India, but then dies of either a fever or rupturing his liver due to too much alcohol. We almost all have been there. He goes on to spread Greek culture far and wide before dying. Further to the west, the aforementioned Latins, found in what is now Rome, would conquer much of the Italian peninsula, create a republic, and defeat their main rival Carthage, and invade many parts of Europe with crappier weather, either by killing or subjugating Celtic and to a lesser extent Germanic populations. Don't feel too bad for those Celts though. Some of them were gingers, and they aren't real people. The Roman Republic eventually got turned into an empire under Julius Caesar and his adopted son Augustus. Around the same time of Augustus's reign, a fellow by the name of Jesus of Nazareth was born in modern-day Palestine/Israel. The Romans first persecuted his followers until a guy by the name of Constantine decided to not persecute Christianity, and would eventually found Constantinople. This would later be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and home to Orthodox Christianity. This is due to the split between the Eastern and Western Roman empires. In the West, there would be the Catholic Church that we're all familiar with. The Western Roman Empire would eventually get overrun by Germanic tribes and the Huns. Rome was eventually sacked by a Germanic tribe known as the Visigoths. The Western Roman Empire would collapse into feudalism, and that kind of sucked unless you like eating cabbage gruel as a serf. Eventually, one Germanic tribe called the Franks, led by Charlemagne, would unite much of Central Europe with the help of the Pope and spread Christianity to the pagans. No, not that Charlemagne. Anyway, Charlemagne would spread Christianity through education and mass murder at the same time. Eventually, you'd see the rise of the Vikings, raiding the trading posts across Europe and many monasteries, eventually landing in the Americas. Meanwhile, Muslim armies would push into Europe from Spain, yet they were halted by the Martells. No, not those Martells. Anyway, in the meantime, the Eastern Roman Empire was dominated by Greeks, and they would eventually request the Pope in Rome for some help fighting the Muslim Turks who were threatening Jerusalem. European Christians would launch several crusades ranging from minor successes to complete epic failures, including one in which they sacked the Christian city of Constantinople. At the time, the Muslim world was more technologically advanced. This script would later be flipped several centuries later. The next time Europeans occupied the Middle East en masse would be the colonialism under Britain, France, and Italy of the 20th century. Now, as time moved forward during the Middle Ages, eventually the Black Death would sweep in, wiping out a massive chunk of Europe's population. Some people thought it was God's will. Others thought it was the devil or the Jews, but in reality it was actually bacteria on fleas on rats. And rats kind of suck, to be honest. I mean, just look at this disgusting thing. After a long enough time of being shit, a rebirth in art and science occurred in Europe, mainly in Italy, especially in the city of Florence. You might have heard of the Renaissance, or rebirth. Another city-state that prospered during this era, and honestly long after it, is Venice. Meanwhile, around the rise of Venice, the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslim, would eventually conquer Constantinople, marking the end of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Middle Ages as we know it. The Ottomans would block trade route opportunities for European Christians. This is at a time when Europeans started to take serious interest in the Orient. So the Portuguese decided to bypass the Ottoman Turks by setting up trade posts in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and were the first Europeans to make contact with Japan. The Ottoman expansion would eventually come to a halt at the gates of Vienna. Next to Portugal was Spain, which recently united and kicked out the Islamic powers to the south and the Jews. This was before the Coexist t-shirt was mass-produced. The Spanish also hired a guy by the name of Christopher Columbus to sail to the Orient, but he instead landed in the Bahamas, Hispaniola, and Cuba looking for some nice sunshine. The native populations of the Americas got decimated through disease, which they had no immunity to. The Spanish set up a system of farming, forcing the natives to, well, be farmers/slaves. But they kept dying from diseases, so they had to import slaves, hence the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, it was actually the Portuguese who started this, but then they just kind of blamed the Spanish. Spain would eventually conquer the Aztecs in Mesoamerica and the Incan Empire in the Andes Mountains of what are now Peru. They would eventually spread Christianity, intermarry with the local populations, and mine enough silver and gold to get rich enough to create hyperinflation to basically send their economy into the shitter, from paradoxically having too much money. Then, back in Europe, there was a guy called Martin Luther, living in what is now Germany. He had some issues with the Pope, and the Pope would eventually excommunicate him for criticizing the Pope. This would start off the Protestant Reformation, and Europeans would spend roughly 30 years fighting over it. Eventually, for the most part, Catholics and Protestants would settle their differences, signing the Peace of Westphalia, which provides the bedrock of the notion of a sovereign state and international law. Other Europeans would take jabs at the Americas, like the Portuguese in Brazil, France in Quebec and Haiti, the Dutch in what is now New York City, and most of all, the English. They set up some colonies, and a 7 Years' War broke out between Britain and France. Britain would eventually become triumphant, taking over what is now Canada, gaining control over India, and starting to settle Australia and New Zealand. Around this time period would emerge the Enlightenment. This would be the 1700s equivalent of owning people with facts and logic. By this time, England and Scotland would unite, America would kick the Britons out, and the French would snip off their king's head. Napoleon would then do some conquering and spread Enlightenment values while simultaneously being an emperor. He would die in exile, but his legacy would spread nationalistic fervor and liberalism. This fervor would inspire ideas that would eventually lead to the unification of other nation-states. Some of the most notable examples of this would be, say, Italy and Germany. By this time, Britain was the most powerful and would continue to colonize other parts of the globe and would eventually become the first country to industrialize. Other Europeans would follow suit in both colonialism and industrialism as they needed resources. And what do you know? There's a whole continent to the south of Europe that has tons and tons of resources. So let's go pillage Africa. Eventually, the balance of power would shift away from purely being based in Britain's hands. Germany, in particular, would become very powerful, and the rise of nationalism across the board would break out into World War I. As entangled alliances clashed, Germany would lose and would get slapped with all the blame, despite really only deserving part of it. Other empires that would collapse were the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Turks, and a few others, namely the Russian Empire. The unfair treaty that was the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, would set up the stage for World War II. Many people called World War I the war to end all wars. Spoiler alert, it didn't end anything, hence why we call it World War I. The humiliation of Germany led to the rise of more nationalism, and an extreme version of it, fascism. This would lead to the rise of Mussolini in Italy as well, and the Spanish Civil War broke out, and eventually you also saw the rise of, well, a guy with a tiny mustache. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of World War II, as there are already a trillion videos on the subject matter. All you need to know is that the Germans and their allies were defeated by Britain, the USSR, and the USA. Berlin would get split into two Germanys, and Europe, by and large, would be split between a pro-US liberal democracy capitalist side and a pro-authoritarian communist USSR side. With the European powers in shambles, a bunch of brown people from all over the world that were mistreated wanted their own land back, hence decolonization, most notably in India. After causing the bloodiest conflict in human history, many Europeans came to the conclusion that, hey, this war thing kind of sucks. So the first steps of European integration began. On security matters, the US would help rebuild much of Western Europe, and it set up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in order to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. This mutual defense pact was put in place to thwart off any Soviet aggression. An attack on one would be an attack on all. And the US would also institute the Marshall Plan. The US would pour tons of money to rebuild Europe so long as they said no to those commie bastards. Churchill would speak of a United States of Europe, a hypothetical single sovereign nation organized as a federated model after the United States. But Europe, with very firm historical unique identities, rejected this. They opted for a more low-key integration instead. So the Council of Europe was founded shortly after World War II based off of these principles. However, France was still deeply worried about Germany for obvious reasons, so they set up the European Coal and Steel Community. By combining the two main industries needed for warfare at the time, coal and steel, you made Germany and France dependent on each other. In the 1950s, the European Economic Community was created as a customs union, followed by the European Atomic Energy Community as well, in order to develop nuclear energy. In the 1980s, the Schengen Region Agreement would create open borders between some European nations. Eventually, communism would collapse in Eastern Europe, and many former USSR allies would see closer ties to Western Europe and the United States instead of Russia. Integration would improve. In 1997, the European Union was implemented, and in 2002, some members of the European Union adopted the euro as a shared currency. Now, did I explain the context well enough? Probably not. There's probably a lot more European geography and history I could get into, but I'm going to press forward into my next video and see if the EU has the potential to be a world superpower. Thanks for watching. Bye.